There is a moment that happens to almost everyone. Someone questions your decision. Someone misunderstands your intention. Someone criticizes the way you speak, the way you live, the choices you make, and almost instinctively you begin explaining yourself. You tell them why you did it. You explain what you meant. You give them the background, the circumstances, the reasons. You add one explanation after another, hoping that eventually they will say, "Now I understand." But notice what is happening psychologically. You have allowed another person to become the judge of your decision, and you have placed yourself in the position of the defendant. This is one of the most subtle forms of psychological weakness because it rarely looks like weakness on the surface. It can look like politeness, it can look like responsibility, it can even look like honesty. But when the need to explain yourself becomes automatic, something deeper is happening. You are trying to control another person's perception of you. And that is a losing game. You cannot control what people think about you. You can influence perception through your actions, your consistency, your character, and your reputation. But you cannot completely control another person's interpretation. The more desperately you try, the more power you give them. Think about how often people explain themselves when they feel misunderstood. A person makes a decision and immediately feels compelled to justify it. Someone refuses a request and then gives 5 reasons why. Someone leaves an unhealthy situation and feels obligated to prove that they had enough reasons to leave. Someone chooses a different path in life and becomes uncomfortable when others question it. Why? Because being misunderstood creates psychological discomfort. Human beings naturally want coherence between who they believe they are and how others perceive them. When those two images collide, we experience tension. We want to repair the gap. We want the other person to see what we see. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes you must be willing to be misunderstood. That is a form of strength. Imagine that someone criticizes a decision you have carefully considered. They may not know your circumstances. They may not understand your priorities. They may only see a small fragment of your life and construct an entire story from it. Your first instinct may be to correct their story, but ask yourself, does their misunderstanding actually damage your life? If the answer is no, why are you spending your energy trying to correct it? This is where emotional discipline begins. Not every opinion deserves a response. Not every accusation deserves a defense. Not every misunderstanding deserves clarification. The person who constantly explains themselves is often communicating something unintentionally. Your interpretation of me matters so much that I need to change it. The person who is internally secure communicates something different. You are free to interpret me as you wish. I know what I am doing. That does not mean becoming arrogant. It does not mean refusing accountability. There are moments when explanation is necessary. If you have genuinely harmed someone, clarification and responsibility matter. If you have made a serious mistake, admitting it is strength, not weakness. The distinction is intention. Are you explaining because communication is genuinely necessary? Or are you explaining because you cannot tolerate someone thinking badly of you? Those are completely different psychological positions. The second one is dangerous because it makes you dependent on approval. And once someone discovers that you desperately need to be understood, they can use that need against you. They criticize you and you rush to defend yourself. They accuse you and you provide evidence. They question your motives and you reveal more of your private thinking. They remain unconvinced, so you explain even more. Eventually, you have handed them access to your emotional center. You have turned a simple disagreement into an interrogation. Powerful communication often works in the opposite direction. You make your position clear and then you stop. You do not fill every silence. You do not rush to convince. You do not reveal every thought simply because someone demands an explanation. There is psychological power in leaving space. Silence forces other people to sit with their own assumptions. It prevents you from becoming trapped in an endless cycle of justification. Most importantly, it teaches you something about yourself. You can survive someone else's disapproval. That realization is liberating, because once you no longer need everyone to approve of you, your decisions become cleaner. You begin making choices according to your values instead of according to anticipated reactions. You stop asking, "How will they perceive this?" and you start asking, "Is this right for me?" That shift changes everything. Look at the people who seem unusually composed under pressure. They are not necessarily people who have never been criticized. In many cases, they have simply developed the ability to remain still when criticism arrives. Someone attacks their character, and they do not immediately react. Someone questions their decision, and they calmly say, "I understand your perspective." Someone demands an explanation, and they decide whether one is actually necessary. This creates an impression of psychological stability, and psychological stability is powerful because people naturally pay attention to those who are not easily pulled off center. You do not have to prove that you are confident. You demonstrate it through what you refuse to do. You refuse to argue with every person who misunderstands you. You refuse to chase people who have already decided what they want to believe. You refuse to turn every disagreement into a courtroom. You refuse to spend your life defending a version of yourself that exists primarily in other people's minds. Instead, you build your reputation through repetition. Your actions become your explanation. Your consistency becomes your argument. Your character becomes your evidence. And over time, people begin to understand something that words could never fully communicate. You are not easily controlled by their approval or disapproval. This is especially important when dealing with people who deliberately provoke you. Some people do not ask questions because they genuinely want information. They ask because they want access to your emotions. They want you to become defensive. They want you to reveal insecurity. They want to watch you struggle to prove your innocence. Recognize the trap. When someone tries to drag you into endless justification, you do not have to accept the invitation. Sometimes a simple sentence is enough. That is your interpretation. Then stop. Notice how difficult that can feel at first. You will want to add another sentence, then another. You will feel the urge to make them understand. Resist it. That discomfort is part of the training. You are teaching yourself that your peace does not depend on winning every psychological argument. You are learning to separate your identity from other people's opinions, and that is the deeper lesson. Confidence is not the ability to make everyone see you correctly. Confidence is the ability to remain yourself when someone sees you incorrectly. The world will misunderstand you sometimes. Let it, not because you are indifferent to people, but because you understand that your life cannot be governed by every passing judgment. There will always be someone who thinks you are too ambitious, too quiet, too distant, too confident, too difficult, too different, or simply wrong. You could spend your entire life correcting them, or you could spend that life becoming stronger. So the next time someone demands an explanation, pause before you answer. Ask yourself one question. Am I communicating because it is necessary, or am I defending myself because I am afraid of being misunderstood? That question alone can transform the way you move through the world. Because when you stop trying to control everyone's perception of you, you begin controlling something far more important, yourself. You do not need to explain and once you begin to understand that you do not have to control how everyone perceives you, another principle becomes essential. You must learn to let your actions speak more loudly than your explanations, because there is a difference between communicating your boundaries and negotiating them. A boundary says, "This is what I will accept, and this is what I will not accept." A negotiation begins when you become desperate for the other person to agree with your boundary. That distinction seems small, but psychologically it changes everything. Imagine someone repeatedly speaks to you disrespectfully. The first time, perhaps you ignore it. The second time, you recognize a pattern. Eventually, you decide that you will no longer participate in conversations where you are treated that way. Now imagine confronting the person. One approach is to deliver a long speech. You explain every incident. You describe how it made you feel. You list the reasons their behavior is unacceptable. You defend your decision from every possible angle. The other approach is much simpler. You cannot speak to me that way. If it continues, I will leave the conversation. Then you follow through. The second approach communicates something much stronger. It communicates consequence, and human beings learn from consequences far more reliably than they learn from explanations. This is one of the most important psychological principles you can understand. People pay attention to what repeatedly happens after they cross a line. You can explain a boundary for 20 minutes, but if you never enforce it, the explanation becomes meaningless. You can say, "I will not tolerate disrespect," but if you continue accepting disrespect every time it happens, people will eventually believe the behavior rather than the words. Your actions teach people how to treat you. This is why consistency is so powerful. When your words and actions are aligned, people do not have to guess where you stand. You become predictable in the healthiest sense of the word. They know that when you say no, you mean no. When you say you will leave, you leave. When you say you will not participate, you do not participate. There is no dramatic performance, no endless argument, no emotional explosion, just consequence, and that calm consistency creates psychological weight. Think about the difference between someone who constantly threatens consequences and someone who quietly follows through. The first person may say, "If you do that again, I'm done with you," but then they remain, they repeat the warning. They become angry, they explain, they forgive, then the same behavior happens again. Eventually, their words lose value. Now consider someone who rarely threatens anything. They simply observe. They give one clear warning when necessary. And if the behavior continues, they act. That person does not need to raise their voice. Their history speaks for them. This is why you should become careful with promises, threats, and declarations. Do not announce boundaries that you are unwilling to enforce. Do not make dramatic statements in moments of anger simply because you want someone to understand that you are serious. Real strength does not need theatrical language. It needs consistency. There is another psychological trap here: the desire to convince people that your boundary is reasonable. You may think, "If I can just explain why this matters to me, they will respect it." But some people are not interested in understanding your boundary. They are interested in testing whether the boundary can be moved. They will question your reasons. Then they will challenge your reasoning. Then they will offer exceptions. Then they will appeal to guilt. And if you continue debating, you have unknowingly turned your boundary into a negotiation. This is why simple language is often more effective. "I can't do that. I've decided not to. That doesn't work for me. I won't continue this conversation if you speak to me disrespectfully." These statements do not invite a courtroom debate. And notice something else: they are centered on your behavior, not on controlling someone else's. A boundary is not, "You are never allowed to criticize me." That is control. A healthier boundary is, "If the conversation becomes insulting, I will end it." Now you are controlling your own response rather than attempting to control another person's mind. That distinction is critical. You cannot force another person to behave well. You can decide what you will participate in. You cannot force someone to respect you. You can decide what you will tolerate. You cannot force someone to value your time. You can decide where your time goes. This is where personal power begins, not with domination, with self-command, and self-command requires something many people find difficult, the ability to tolerate discomfort. Because enforcing a boundary can create temporary tension, the other person may become angry. They may accuse you of being selfish. They may call you arrogant. They may say that you have changed. They may attempt to make you feel guilty. And this is precisely where many people surrender. They do not actually disagree with their boundary. They simply cannot tolerate the emotional discomfort that comes after enforcing it, so they retreat. They apologize, they explain, they soften their position, they restore the old arrangement, and the other person learns an important lesson. Pressure works. Once someone learns that emotional pressure can make you abandon your own standards, they have discovered a lever they can pull whenever they want. That is why emotional discipline matters. You must become capable of allowing someone to be disappointed with you. You must become capable of allowing someone to misunderstand your decision. You must become capable of letting another person experience the consequence of their own behavior without immediately rescuing them from it. This does not make you cruel. It makes you responsible for yourself. There is a philosophical principle underneath all of this. Your freedom is directly connected to your willingness to accept the consequences of your choices. If you want the freedom to say no, you must accept that some people will dislike your no. If you want the freedom to leave unhealthy situations, you must accept that someone may accuse you of abandoning them. If you want the freedom to pursue your own goals, you must accept that people may call you selfish. Every meaningful form of independence carries a price. The weak position is trying to obtain freedom without ever disappointing anyone. That is impossible. Someone will always be disappointed when you stop giving them unlimited access to your time, energy, attention, or resources. So stop measuring the quality of your boundaries by how peacefully other people receive them. Measure them by whether you can enforce them without betraying yourself. And this brings us back to the central theme. Stop explaining yourself endlessly. Your life should not require a permanent defense attorney. You do not need to provide a detailed argument every time you make a personal decision. You need clarity. You need consistency, and you need consequences. When your actions repeatedly match your standards, people eventually understand where you stand. You become someone whose no has meaning, someone whose time has value, someone whose attention cannot be demanded. Someone whose boundaries are not merely words, and perhaps most importantly, you begin to respect yourself more. Because self-respect is not created by demanding that other people respect you. It is created by refusing to repeatedly participate in situations that violate your own standards. Every time you enforce a reasonable boundary, you send a message to yourself: my judgment matters. My time matters, my peace matters. And the more consistently you live according to that message, the less you need external validation. You become quieter but stronger, less reactive but more decisive, less interested in proving yourself, and more interested in living deliberately. So the next time someone crosses a line, do not rush into a speech. Do not build a courtroom. Do not beg them to understand. State the boundary clearly, then let your behavior carry the weight of your words, because ultimately people may forget what you explained. They rarely forget what you consistently allowed, and once you understand that your boundaries are defined not by what you say, but by what you consistently enforce, you arrive at the final, and perhaps most difficult lesson: not every battle deserves your voice. This is where emotional detachment becomes a form of power. Most people believe strength means having the perfect response. They imagine that if someone insults them, they must immediately answer. If someone spreads a rumor, they must correct it. If someone challenges their character, they must defend themselves. If someone provokes them, they must prove that they cannot be intimidated. But think about the psychology of this. If another person can say a few words and instantly determine what you feel, what you say, and how you behave, who is actually in control? You may believe you are defending yourself, but psychologically, you may simply be reacting, and reaction is often what the other person wanted. There are people who understand that provoking someone is a way of gaining access to their attention. They do not necessarily want a rational conversation. They want an emotional reaction because your reaction gives them information. They learn what makes you angry. They learn what makes you insecure. They learn which accusations force you to defend yourself. They learn which subjects cause you to reveal too much, and once they understand your emotional triggers, they know where to press. This is why emotional detachment matters. Detachment does not mean becoming cold or emotionless. It means creating a small space between what happens to you and what you choose to do about it. Something happens, you notice the emotion, you allow yourself to experience it, but you do not immediately obey it. That pause is where your power lies. Imagine someone says something insulting to you in front of a group of people. Your body reacts immediately, your heart rate changes, you feel anger, your mind begins constructing a response. You suddenly remember everything this person has ever done, and within seconds you are preparing an argument. But what if you simply paused? What if you looked at them and realized, this person is attempting to pull me into a reaction? Suddenly the situation changes, you are no longer trapped inside the emotion, you are observing the emotion. That is a completely different psychological position. The ability to observe yourself while you are emotionally activated is one of the foundations of self-mastery. You begin asking better questions. Why did that statement affect me? What does this person actually want? Will responding improve my position? Am I defending something important? Or am I defending my ego? That last question is especially powerful. The ego wants to be seen as correct. It wants the final word. It wants everyone watching to know that you were not intimidated. It wants to repair every insult immediately. But life is not a courtroom where every disagreement must produce a winner. Sometimes winning the argument means losing your peace. Sometimes proving your point means giving someone more attention than they deserve. Sometimes defending your reputation actually makes you look more concerned about the accusation than you would have appeared by simply continuing to live consistently. This is why silence can be strategically powerful. Silence does not automatically mean weakness. Sometimes silence means you have evaluated the situation and decided that your attention is too valuable to spend there. There is a difference between being unable to respond and choosing not to respond. The first is helplessness. The second is discipline, and people can often sense that difference. Think about how much energy people waste explaining themselves to those who have no intention of understanding them. They write long messages, they replay conversations, they prepare imaginary arguments, they imagine what they should have said. They return to the same conflict again and again inside their minds. Notice the tragedy of this. The other person may have forgotten the entire interaction, while you are still carrying it hours later. You are giving someone free space inside your mind. That is an expensive price for a meaningless battle. Emotional detachment means learning to close the door. Not every thought deserves investigation. Not every insult deserves analysis. Not every accusation deserves a defense. Not every person deserves access to your attention. This is especially important in an age where people are constantly encouraged to react publicly. Someone posts something about you, someone makes a comment, someone misinterprets you. Immediately, there is an impulse to respond. But public reaction can turn a minor event into a major one. The more you explain, the more material you create for people to analyze, criticize, distort, or manipulate. Sometimes the smartest move is to allow the noise to remain noise. Your reputation is not built in one conversation. It is built through patterns. If you consistently behave with integrity, one person's accusation does not erase that history. If your actions consistently demonstrate who you are, you do not need to chase every rumor. Time has a way of revealing patterns. People eventually notice who repeatedly creates conflict. They notice who constantly attacks others. They notice who always needs an audience. They notice who remains composed. This is why you should think in terms of the long game. A reactive person thinks about the next 5 minutes. A strategic person thinks about the next 5 years. The reactive person asks, how do I make them regret what they just said? The strategic person asks, what response best protects my future? Those questions lead to completely different behavior. One produces emotional satisfaction, the other produces control, and sometimes the most powerful decision is to walk away. Walking away can feel strange because the ego tells you that leaving means losing, but consider the alternative. You remain in the argument. You become increasingly angry. You say things you later regret. The other person becomes more aggressive. Now both of you are emotionally invested. What did you gain? Nothing. You simply allowed someone else to determine where your attention went. Walking away says something different. This interaction no longer serves me. That is not surrender. That is selection. You are choosing where to place your energy. And your energy is one of the most valuable resources you possess. You cannot recover yesterday's attention. You cannot reclaim the hours spent obsessing over someone else's opinion. You cannot build your future while constantly turning around to fight people from your past. At some point, you must decide that your attention belongs to your purpose. This does not mean avoiding every difficult conversation. Some conflicts must be addressed. Some betrayals require consequences. Some relationships require honest confrontation. But confrontation should be deliberate, not emotional. You enter the conversation knowing what you want. You communicate clearly, you listen, you decide, and then you move forward. You do not turn the conversation into an opportunity to unload every emotion you have accumulated over the years. You do not confuse emotional release with strategic action. That distinction separates impulse from maturity. The strongest person in the room is often not the loudest person. It is the person who can remain internally stable while everyone else is losing control. That person has learned something most people never fully learn. You cannot control what others say. You cannot control what others believe. You cannot control whether someone respects you, but you can control what receives your attention. And attention is power. Where your attention goes, your emotional energy follows. Where your emotional energy goes, your behavior follows. And where your behavior repeatedly goes, your life eventually follows. So protect your attention. When someone tries to provoke you, pause. When someone misunderstands you, decide whether correction matters. When someone insults you, observe before responding. When someone demands an explanation, ask whether they genuinely need one. And when a conflict has no meaningful outcome, have the courage to leave it unfinished. You do not have to win every battle. You only have to stop losing yourself in battles that were never worth fighting. Because the ultimate form of strength is not having an answer for everyone. It is having enough control over yourself that you no longer feel compelled to answer everyone.